Zambia's currency has gained almost 10% against the dollar since the start of last month. On Monday alone, it jumped nearly 4% before reaching a fresh two-year high on Tuesday. Here's why. Firstly, copper prices are surging. 3-month copper futures jumped around 5% on Tuesday. And Zambia is the second largest copper producer in Africa.
Currencies, which would reduce their dependency on the US dollar. The Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, or COMSA, has launched a digital payment system. It would allow the 21 member nations of the regional economic bloc to settle cross-border payments in local currencies, eliminating the need to convert them into hard currencies like the American dollar for international trade.
For decades, one currency has quietly ruled the world. It prices oil, it settles trade, it underpins global power. But now, something unexpected is happening. Across Africa, conversations are shifting away from dependency toward control, not with speeches, not with protests, but with systems, quiet coordination, and long-term planning. This isn't about replacing the dollar overnight. It's about what happens when an entire continent starts asking a dangerous question: what if we didn't need it at all? For most of modern history, Africa hasn't controlled the currencies that shape its economic fate. Trade has been priced externally. Debt has been issued externally. Global transactions even between African nations have often passed through foreign financial systems using foreign currencies. That reality wasn't accidental. It was inherited. Colonial monetary structures evolved into post-independence dependencies. Even as political control shifted, financial architecture remained outward-facing. The US dollar became the default bridge for trade, reserves, debt servicing, and stability. And for a long time, that system seemed unavoidable. The dollar offered liquidity, predictability, access. But it also came with exposure. Every time global interest rates moved, African economies felt it. Every time sanctions reshaped payment channels elsewhere, ripple effects landed locally. And every time capital flowed towards safe havens, currencies weakened regardless of domestic fundamentals. This created a paradox. African economies could grow yet still remain financially constrained. And that tension has been building quietly for years. The spark didn't come from ideology, it came from friction. Global shocks exposed vulnerabilities that had always existed but were easy to ignore during stable times. Supply chain disruptions, pandemic-era liquidity squeezes, rising borrowing costs, currency volatility that made imports more expensive overnight. Each shock reinforced the same lesson: reliance on external monetary systems carries a cost. What changed recently was scale. Africa is no longer a collection of isolated markets. Intra-African trade is expanding. Regional blocs are integrating. Cross-border infrastructure is connecting economies that once operated independently. As integration increases, inefficiencies become harder to justify. Why should trade between neighboring countries require third-party currencies? Why should exchange rate exposure add cost to regional commerce? Why should African growth be hostage to external monetary policy cycles? Those questions are no longer theoretical, they're practical, and that's where the currency conversation enters, not as a sudden rebellion but as a gradual recalibration. The idea isn't a single paper bill replacing the dollar tomorrow, it's something more subtle: reducing reliance, local currency settlement systems, regional payment platforms, clearing mechanisms that bypass unnecessary intermediaries, longer-term exploration of shared monetary tools. Each step alone looks modest. Together they represent a shift in mindset. The goal is resilience, not disruption. It's important to understand what this isn't. It isn't a unified African currency ready to roll out tomorrow. It isn't an attempt to dethrone the dollar globally. It isn't a rejection of global markets. It's an attempt to rebalance risk. Dollar dependence concentrates exposure. When that exposure becomes costly, diversification becomes rational, not political. And that rationale is gaining traction because conditions demand it. Debt servicing costs have risen sharply. Currency depreciation amplifies those costs. Import prices rise faster than incomes. Governments face pressure to stabilize without draining reserves. In that environment, monetary autonomy stops being abstract. It becomes survival math. At the same time, Africa's economic profile is changing. The continent holds a growing share of the world's strategic resources: energy transition materials, agricultural output, young labor markets, emerging manufacturing hubs. As relevance increases, negotiating power follows. And with power comes choice. External partners are paying closer attention not because Africa is making noise, but because it is making sense. What unsettles observers isn't an announcement of a new currency. It's the realization that options are multiplying. Historically, the dollar's strength hasn't come from force alone. It came from necessity. If alternatives felt risky or fragmented, the dollar remained the safest path. But what happens when alternatives aren't revolutionary? Just functional? When systems don't aim to replace the dollar everywhere but to reduce its role where it is least needed? That's the quiet threat, because dominance erodes not through confrontation but through irrelevance. No empire wakes up to find its currency replaced overnight. It finds that fewer transactions depend on it, that settlement patterns shift, that reserve compositions evolve. That influence weakens incrementally. This is why the conversation matters now. Africa isn't attempting to shock the world, it's attempting to insulate itself, and insulation doesn't require consensus across 50-plus nations. It begins regionally, sectorally, incrementally, trade first, payments next, then scale, critics argue. Fragmentation risks instability, supporters argue dependency already created it. Both sides have merit, but what's undeniable is that the status quo no longer feels neutral, it feels costly. And once a system is perceived as costly rather than beneficial, the search for alternatives becomes inevitable. This isn't about ideology, it's about arithmetic. How much volatility can economies absorb? How much external exposure is acceptable? How much control is too little? Those are the questions driving this shift, not slogans. The reason this story matters globally is simple. The dollar's strength has always rested on usage, and usage depends on necessity. As Africa's economic integration deepens, and as its financial infrastructure modernizes, necessity evolves. That doesn't mean the dollar disappears. It means it faces competition in places it once took for granted. And history shows that once competition exists, power dynamics change even if slowly. Because currencies don't gain power from announcements, they gain power from usage, and usage depends on systems that work quietly, reliably, and at scale. The most important change happening across Africa is not the creation of a single new currency, it is the redesign of payment infrastructure. For decades, even trade between African countries often moved through external clearing systems. A shipment from one African port to another might be priced in dollars, settled through foreign correspondent banks, and exposed to exchange rate risk on both sides. That inefficiency wasn't accidental, it was inherited. But today that structure is being questioned. The focus has shifted to local and regional settlement mechanisms, platforms that allow trade to be settled in domestic currencies while clearing occurs internally. These systems don't eliminate the dollar globally, they simply remove it where it adds cost without adding value. This is where the shift becomes practical rather than symbolic. When businesses can transact without currency conversion losses, volatility drops. When importers and exporters know their costs won't change overnight because of external interest rate decisions, planning improves. When reserves aren't constantly drained to stabilize exchange rates, governments gain room to maneuver. These gains are modest at first, but cumulative. Another major area of movement is trade diversification. When trade is heavily oriented toward external markets, external currencies dominate naturally. As intra-African trade expands, the incentive to rely on external settlement shrinks. This is where regional integration plays a critical role. As supply chains develop across borders, manufacturing inputs, agricultural processing, energy distribution, currency coordination becomes less optional. You can't build a regional market using tools designed for external dependence. So instead of announcing a continent-wide currency, efforts focus on compatibility, harmonizing payment rails, aligning banking standards, reducing cross-border friction. Each step lowers the cost of doing business internally and gradually changes currency behavior. But progress isn't linear. Africa isn't a single economy. Its currencies vary widely in stability, liquidity, and trust that makes any unified approach difficult. Stronger currencies hesitate to absorb risk from weaker ones. Weaker currencies seek protection without losing sovereignty. This tension explains why experimentation is cautious. Pilot programs come first, limited corridors, specific trade sectors, incremental scaling. The goal isn't perfection, it's proof of concept. Another critical factor is external partnerships. Africa doesn't operate in isolation. Major trading partners still expect predictability. Sudden shifts scare capital, so any monetary evolution has to coexist with global systems rather than confront them. That's why diversification matters more than replacement. If settlement occurs in multiple currencies, exposure spreads. If reserves diversify gradually, risk is managed. If trade contracts include options rather than mandates, trust is preserved. This is a balancing act, not a revolution. which brings us to the limits. Dollar dominance didn't emerge just because of political influence. It emerged because of deep markets, liquidity, legal frameworks, and decades of confidence. Alternatives don't replicate that overnight. Liquidity takes time, trust takes longer, crisis performance matters most. The real test isn't whether a system works during calm periods, it's whether it holds under stress. That's why observers should temper expectations. Africa's currency initiatives won't eliminate dollar use, they will coexist with it. And in some cases reinforce it where global trade still demands scale and liquidity, but coexistence is still change, because every transaction that doesn't require the dollar weakens exclusivity, and exclusivity is the foundation of dominance. What unsettles traditional power centers isn't the idea of a new African currency tomorrow. It's the idea that necessity is declining. That global actors may still choose the dollar but no longer need to by default. That shift doesn't show up in dramatic headlines. It appears in data lagging months behind, in trade settlement ratios, in reserve composition adjustments, in quiet infrastructure investment. It also changes negotiating dynamics. When countries know they have alternatives, even imperfect ones, leverage changes, pressure has diminishing returns, alignment becomes optional rather than enforced. That's where geopolitical attention intensifies, not because the dollar is collapsing but because influence has gradients and gradients matter. Critics argue that currency fragmentation risks instability, inflation, and fragmentation. That's true. Poorly managed transitions are dangerous, but defenders counter that existing dependence already imports instability from external cycles. The real debate isn't binary, it's about where risk sits. Do economies absorb volatility locally or import it wholesale? Do governments respond to domestic conditions or external signals? Do businesses plan around production or currency survival? Those questions don't have ideological answers, they have accounting ones, and accounting drives policy more reliably than rhetoric. Perhaps the most underestimated consequence of this shift is psychological. Once actors believe alternatives are possible, behavior changes before systems fully mature, businesses explore options, banks test corridors, governments adjust language, expectations move first, infrastructure follows. That expectation shift is already underway, not loudly, not uniformly, but persistently, which is why claims of a sudden new currency replacing the dollar miss the point. The real story is slower and more durable. Africa isn't abandoning the dollar, it's renegotiating its role, and that renegotiation, if successful, won't collapse global finance, it will redistribute flexibility. In the final phase, the question becomes unavoidable: what happens to global power when no single currency is indispensable? And no single region is structurally dependent? Because history suggests that once dependency fades, influence must be earned rather than assumed, and that shift, once embedded, is very difficult to reverse.